Hello and welcome to Book Lust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today at University Bookstore is novelist Jeffrey Eugenides, author of 3 books, The Virgin Suicides, Middlesex, and The Marriage Plot. Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. Blue sky, Seattle day.
I've been a fan of your writing since The Virgin Suicides came out, and it was one of those books that it's written in, I think, my favorite point of view, which is second person plural.
First person plural.
First person plural, sorry.
That's your favorite?
That is my favorite. It's so rare, but I just love
it
when it's really done well. But it seems to me that each of your books, and let me just put in a parenthesis there, I really admire that it takes you more than 8 months to finish a book.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I've been taking a fair amount of grief from the slowness of my publishing schedule.
Your oeuvre.
You know, but if I could control it and do it every book a year, I would gladly do that. It just hasn't worked out.
Well, right, and I think as a fan, I would always want you to write faster so that there would be another book for me to read, or so I could see where you're going this time and your sort of trajectory. But as a fan of really well-written books, I think that would be harder to do in a very brief amount of time.
Well, I have a book of short stories almost finished now, so the next one won't take so long from The Marriage Plot. At least, yeah.
So tell us, The Marriage Plot is your newest novel. It's just out, and it's really, in a way, a growth, or it seems to me that it's really a change from a change in approach, maybe, than the earlier, even both books.
It is, absolutely. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I think when you finish a book, I mean, each book takes you to your next place, and you learn a set of skills with each book. The Virgin Suicides, very much about the voice. I was just learning how to control a narrative voice and how to people a world, but I didn't tend to go into the other characters' minds very much. The whole idea of that book was the male narrator's inability to know the Lisbon girls. So it's not a book that has deep characterization except for the voice itself. And then with Middlesex, I began to learn how to create characters in a deeper way, and I learned to have a complicated plot. But when I finished that book, what I yearned to do next was to go very deeply into just a few characters, and to let the characters' peculiarities, ambitions, difficulties animate the whole book, or give me my plot. Instead of coming up maybe with a plot and putting characters into it, the drama's coming out of the characters in this book. And to me, it did feel like a kind of advance in maturity, because I do less monkey business in this book than I think I've done before. The language is a little bit more restrained, so as to allow the characters to come to the foreground of the book, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. This new, I don't know, it's somewhat more realistic, but not quite. But it felt like a change in my style and my narrative attitude, and accorded with my middle-aged status now a little bit, I think.
Well, it's the story of 3 graduates of Brown University and who have graduated in 1982. So that puts them pre-cell phones, and
yes, it does.
And very conveniently.
Yeah.
I think.
I think I could have written this book in the present day with text messaging and cell phones, but I saw no reason to, because I also wanted to be faithful to the period. Faithful to college life, and since I remember college in the 80s, it seemed sensible to set the book then. And so much of the book deals with semiotics and literary criticism that was popular in those days, that I wanted to keep it in the 80s for that reason as well.
It's funny how little you hear about Derrida these days.
You hear of a lot less. I mean, I teach at Princeton, so you hear about him, and he's a lasting figure, and his books are still in the library prominently displayed.
Oh yes.
But I don't hear about him every day like I used to.
Not in popular normal conversation.
Right.
Oh, like gosh, what's he doing these days?
True.
I read an article where you talked about, or what you wrote this when you talked about how writing Middlesex was interrupted by this book. what would become this book.
Right.
Could you tell about that?
Yeah, it was the late 90s, and I was having a difficult time with Middlesex, not sure how to move forward with it. And then, of course, that made me long to write something simpler, something very different than Middlesex. So I put the manuscript aside for, I can't remember how long, perhaps a month, and I started writing a novel that was about a rich family having a debutante party. And pretty quickly I realized that this novel too would become difficult, and I understood what had been impeding my progress with Middlesex, so I went back to Middlesex. When Middlesex was published, though, I had this novel waiting for me, and I plunged back into it and worked on it for a couple of years, actually. And then one of the characters, I mean, all of the characters in the marriage plot existed in that book about the debutante party. There was Madeline, she had a boyfriend, and Mitchell was there, and he was in love with Madeline. But as I began to write her story, Madeline's part of the book, I kept going. I became very involved with her life at college, and little by little I realized that she was not meant to be in the novel I'd put her into. She was actually a different person than the daughter of this family that I thought she was going to be. So I had to separate them. And one day in Chicago, I came to the kind of dreadful conclusion that I had two novels on my hand, and that I was going to have to jettison one and jettison a number of years of work in order to stay with these three characters. But I felt that the prose I was writing about Madeline and Mitchell and Leonard was of different quality, and something about that book was gelling in the way that the other book wasn't. So it was a necessary collateral damage, I guess. But at least I finally got another book out of it. So.
Do you think you'll go back to that other one?
I thought I would. I mean, the only way I could keep myself from committing suicide when I had to throw away 3 years of work was to tell myself, well, I can go back and finish that one later. But now that I'm finished with the marriage plot, I'm not feeling much like going back to the debutante party novel. It was a rather insular kind of book, and the marriage plot allowed me to open up the structure quite a bit, and it feels more like a proper novel to me. So I don't think so. The other one felt almost like a play.
Or a short story that you could...
Somewhat like a short story, but it was a lot of logistical problems and bringing everyone together at one moment, and I didn't want to do that. I don't think I'll go back to it.
Because
some of the ideas I'm sure
really
will come
interesting.
out. I'm sorry?
It sounds very interesting.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I'm sure some of the material from that book will come out in another novel, but I'm not sure I'll treat it the same way. Yeah.
Was Mitchell autobiographical in some ways?
Somewhat. I mean, all the characters are autobiographical. Like Madeline could be lots of women that I knew at college, and then lots of me goes into her. And the same thing with Leonard, but Mitchell is the one that bears the most obvious similarity to me, being half hillbilly, half Greek, and taking this long trip and working for Mother Teresa. But I find that I have a very difficult time writing autobiographical fiction for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that my own life story is not that captivating, so it's just inherently boring to write about myself. And the second one is that when I write about myself, it's harder for me to discern what's interesting and what's necessary for a story and what just merely happened to me. So when I was writing the 40 pages of this book that happened in Calcutta, I probably had 100 to 120 pages because I wrote about everything I remembered from that time. But most of that was not necessary to tell Mitchell's story. So I had to cut so much out, and it bedeviled me for over a year. Whereas Leonard's section, telling events about mental illness that I don't share, I wrote that in 3 or 4 months, which for me is rather quickly because I didn't have actual memories competing with the fiction and the invention.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I can see how that could in some ways be paralyzing.
The truth.
The truth, right.
The truth
Instead of setting you free, it paralyzes you.
Right.
Yeah. What is your writing process? You know, when you were doing, for example, Middlesex, which was had a lot going on and a lot of back and forthing and you know, the history parts that you put in. And I mean, how do you keep all that straight, especially over a number of years?
Well, while you're working on a book, you sort of have the random access memory of everything you need for that book. You forget maybe the previous book and you can't remember where you left your glasses, but you're working on it. So I remember quite well all the pieces of a novel when I'm working on it, or discarded portions. And I'll often think, wait, what was that bit I wrote 2 years ago? That would actually be perfect here, and then I'll hunt around in my files and I'll find perhaps a paragraph that will serve. So that's what it's like. It's just because I'm doing it every day and spending most of my time, it's all present in my mind. I don't have to have too much of a, I don't know, like a record. I kind of know where things are, more or less, and I can find them when I need them.
So you don't have like a bunch of sticky notes or a storyboard that...
I do that too. I constantly write out. I have a journal that I use that is where I put my problems with plot, and I'll sketch out how this should be, then the next 100 pages how it's going to go, just to give myself a sense of where the book is going. And then of course as I write it, I often find that my my plans are actually insufficient. Usually when you plan a story quickly, the kinds of things, the kinds of plot points that you come up with are too simplistic. They're the kinds that you would just come up with off your head, and the reader can guess them too, and perhaps they're not even meaningful by the time you get to them. So I constantly have to revise my plans, but I have them there to take me along, and I'll just keep revising, and the notebook is full of jottings and it looks disorganized, and it is, because it's a disorganized process to arrive at the end.
Is there a notebook for every book?
Yes, yeah.
So who are you going to leave your papers to?
Whoever asks nicely.
Oh, I bet the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas, or Princeton, maybe. That would be very interesting. Do you ever go back to those early notebooks? I mean, like the notebook for the Virgin Suicides?
I think I didn't have one for the Virgin Suicides. I have one for Middlesex.
Oh, that makes you much less valuable.
Wonder where it is. I have lots of with Virgin Suicides. I was working on the job and at work, so I have good manuscript pages of that on like office stationery and things like that. So.
Did you always know you wanted to write?
Pretty early on, in high school, I decided to be a writer, and it amuses me now because I can't decide anything, like where to live or, what kind of shoes to buy. But at 16, 17, I decided that's it for me. I want to be a writer, and I never looked back.
And in college, did you have supportive writing
I did. I had a great teacher, John Hawkes at Brown, who I took many workshops with, and there were a lot of other writers at Brown. Rick Moody, Donald Antrim were classmates of mine, and Melora Wolfe and Chase Twitchell were always there too, the two friends of mine. So we had a little group of writers and people who thought they were going to be writers and were serious about it, which was really helpful at a young age. Helps you to take yourself more seriously when you have companions like that.
Since you seem to be such a down-to-earth sort of person, how do you keep yourself anchored as yourself, or do you think about or sort of drift off into thinking, Jeffrey Eugenides, writer? I mean, or is there a difference? Maybe there's not even a difference.
You only feel like yourself. I think I don't know how many people believe their own press, or how many people I don't know, get somehow so obsessed with the idea of themselves and who they are that they lose sense of. I've met certain actors that happens to. I think it happens with extreme fame. I don't think it's such a danger with writing. You're home alone most of the time, in obscurity, and you're taking care of your children and driving them to school. So it's only now and then that you come out and become a public person, and it doesn't really pervade your sense of self. But I don't think most people, even really truly famous people, I think they really realize how fake the public image is, and I think it's probably not that hard for them just to understand they're still the same person they always were.
It's
So
interesting.
I've met a few actors where you can feel what fame has done to them.
Right.
And if it was on a huge scale, it must become a burden, and it must warp your personality, I think.
I mean, that they become their persona.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Or you're just always aware when you come into a room that everyone is going to turn and recognize you. That has to do something to
Yeah,
you
right,
after a while, right?
right.
And
Oh,
make you
yeah.
not want to go outside.
Yeah,
But, yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. So how did the plot, are you a reader of Victorian novel?
Yeah, I'm a big reader of, not so much of the Jane Austen. Madeline is more of an Austenite than I was, but Henry James is a big passion of mine, ongoing passion. And you know, the great marriage plot for me is The Portrait of a Lady. And I love Anna Karenina as well, which is a kind of marriage plot. So those novels were important to me, and perhaps were the ones that I had most in my head in writing this book.
So when those characters, Madeline and Leonard and Mitchell, came to you, did you immediately understand what their connection was going to be, or did those two things come simultaneously?
Well, they were all there. I mean, it started with the line, Madeline's love troubles began at the time when the French theory she was reading deconstructed the very notion of love.
Yeah.
So I had this woman in college reading semiotics, trying to understand that romance and love is a construct, that she has been brainwashed by all of the romantic literature that she's read, and she's trying not to be a romantic sap anymore, and yet as she's trying to do this intellectually, emotionally, she's still falling in love with Leonard. So I had a hazy idea of this boyfriend, and then I had also Mitchell, who was in love with Madeline. So they were there pretty early on, but I didn't know how they related. I didn't know the book would be called The Marriage Plot or have to do with the marriage plot. I just knew three people were at college with various competing desires.
And then where did the title is so wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, so
my wife thinks it's boring and old-fashioned, but I stuck with it.
Oh, but it is. But it's it's not a boring story, but it's an old-fashioned story.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the sort of trio of people who want to be together and can't be together and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I actually liked it because I think of what it said.
Philip Roth said he liked it too, not to me, but someone else. So that's two good
good.
points for the
Yeah,
favor.
yeah.
you and Roth. I feel better now. I'll tell my wife.
So do you read like Donald Antrim and Rick Moody and those? Are those?
Yes, I mean when we were young, we actually traded manuscripts, and now we don't as much. But I read my contemporaries and my friends.
Who are people that some of our viewers you would suggest that they might like to read?
Colm Tóibín, the Irish writer, is a writer who seems just to be getting better and better with each book. His new book of short stories, The Empty Family, is really fine, and Brooklyn was such a great success in this country. And The Master, about Henry James, is a wonderful book. And there's a German writer named Daniel Kehlmann who wrote Measuring the World. Have you read that? That's a wonderful book. It's about Alexander von Humboldt.
Oh, right.
Who goes around the world measuring it physically, and Gauss, the mathematician, who measures the world sitting in one place with the power of his brain. And the one serendipitous meeting they had in Berlin in, I can't remember what year. And it's a really wonderful book, kind of an intellectual, playful, amusing book. So I always look forward to his new books when they come out. And Richard Ford is a writer that I really admire, and he's got a book coming out next year I'm eagerly awaiting.
Do you see in your next book, are you thinking about your next book?
I have an idea, but I don't know if it's workable or not.
Do you think you're going to stick with the emphasis on characters, let it begin with the characters again? Or?
Yes, I think one of the reasons that my books have come out so far apart is they're all dissimilar, and I'm constantly reinventing the wheel. Each book I've written, I've had to learn how to write that book, whereas certain writers have a way of doing it, and they can, in a way, repeat the process.
And does that make you gnash your teeth with envy and frustration?
No, so far it's been fine. I've gotten tired of writing one kind of book, and I wanted to change. But the mode I'm in now, this third-person mode, is one I want to stick with for a while, I think. So I can imagine maybe my next book not being as dissimilar from The Marriage Plot as perhaps The Marriage Plot is from The Virgin Suicides and Middlesex. So there's like a middle period or something happening to me, I hope. And so I might as well milk it a little bit.
With The Marriage Plot, you know, it's the 1980s and it's college life and immediately after college and sort of people finding themselves and understanding who they are. But Middlesex was had a much wider history that you drew on. And was that a book you felt you had to kind of write, not necessarily that book, but a book including that terrible history that you retell?
I didn't set out knowing that those things would be part of Middlesex at all. I originally thought it would be a short fictional autobiography of an intersex person. I wanted the novel narrated by this person who had lived both as a girl and a boy.
And that has a wonderful first line too.
Yes,
Middlesex does. Yes.
Thank you. But in trying to write that book, I wanted to be as truthful as I could about the biology and genetics involved in my narrator, not to make a gender bending narrator who's a fairy tale, but a real person, because this is a real condition. And the condition led me to genetics because it comes from a mutated recessive gene, and genetics led me back into the past and into the history of Greek immigrants. I decided to draw on that because I knew something about it from my own grandparents. So the story and the research I did gave me access to the history, and then suddenly the book was a large comic epic with all these parts in it that I didn't know that would be, and I didn't feel I'm going, I must sit down and write the Greek American story. That didn't interest me at all. It's just that was the only way I could tell this story that I wanted to tell. What
about reviews? As a novelist, I mean, how important are they to you?
In fact, Franzen himself, I was discussing this with him recently, and he doesn't read his reviews. And I never believed novelists when they said they didn't read their reviews. But he suggested that it was very healthy practice. And then Jhumpa Lahiri, just last week, told me she doesn't read hers either. So for this book, I'm not reading them. I have always read for my other books. And fortunately for the other ones, there weren't too many horrible ones to read, and maybe they kept the bad ones away from me, so I wasn't scarred. But I do find that they're not helpful. You're quite aware of what the faults of your book are, and it's rare that a review will reveal to you something that would be useful for your next book. You know what you didn't do right in a book and what you want to do better. And so a review is mainly, half it's going to be plot summary, then you certainly know what happened in the book. And then often you get criticized for things you weren't trying to do. So the result of that is just making you angry and making you think about this person's opinion as opposed to your actual readers who you're meeting every day. So I'm right now keeping the reviews away from my head.
I actually think that's a good idea.
Yeah? When you talk to people, how many are on one side of the fence? They do read.
Most read their reviews.
Do they?
Yes.
It's it's hard not to, because people will tell you what it was. Oh, you already got a bad review.
Yeah, right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, so it's kind of hard. I got an email today from John Irving, who read some apparently not terribly flattering review of my new book. So I don't want to read that part of the email.
Right.
But
yeah. I mean, it's hard to keep in mind that it's just one person's opinion and how intelligent that person is, or what criteria they've used,
or what motive they have,
or what motive they have. I think is just so.
It depends where it is too. If it's in a place that is powerful, then their view gets amplified. Whereas if it's in, the tiny little local paper in Butte. The worst part of it is knowing that the other people have read the scathing review about you.
Yes.
So if it's in New York Times and you live in New York, you know, even if you can maybe say, I don't care about the review, it's fine.
Right.
What will bother you is going out and that everyone has read it and is
Right.
thinking perhaps you're upset. That's almost
Right.
worse. So if you don't read them, one thing I'm finding is I don't attribute all those thoughts to my friends and other people, because I haven't read the word, so I don't know.
Right.
So it makes you a little more psychologically healthy, I think.
You said you had a collection of short stories almost ready, so it's not going to be. Are you finding that the tightness of a short story is a challenge that you're eager to rise to, or?
Well, I've wanted to write short stories and a successful short story for a long time, because I think the form is extremely hard. I think it's harder than writing a novel in many ways. And I've written some to my satisfaction. They tend to be about 30 pages long. They're not really short stories. I have a few that are about 20. But it's a form that interests me, but I find it extremely difficult, and I much prefer writing novels. So I'll do this collection, and I don't know if I'll do another one. I really do. The way my mind works is to get one idea and to put another idea next to it and another idea. And it's just more natural for me to write novels than short stories for some reason.
Do you think Master of Fine Arts programs are useful for writers, or? I
think they are. You know, they give you a couple of years to just concentrate on your writing, and you get a lot of feedback, and you can learn things about the way you write and mistakes you make. You can't become a novelist or a short story writer just by going to school, but it doesn't impede your progress at all. You know, you're finally going to have to figure it all out on yourself. But I don't see it as harmful. And they used to talk a lot about the imprint of a certain place on the writers. So you had the Iowa School. Right. Everyone was writing like Raymond Carver. Right. And that's gone away. I see people coming out of these different schools, and they're not carbon copies of the teachers or anything else.
I know they're
right?
writing like genre novels, and
that's the new thing, right?
Yeah, right. Are you going to do a werewolf one?
No, not me. Not me. Sticking with good old people.
Reality.
Yeah. I like reality. It's not worn out for me yet.
Yeah. Well, being a Henry James fan, I think that more or less reality would be a major concern of yours.
I think so. No dragons for me.
Right. Now, what about Edith Wharton?
Is she? Sure. Yeah. House of Mirth.
Yeah. Because I always thought that she did the kind of marriage plot pretty well in that way.
Right.
Well, all I can say to our viewers is that pick up the marriage plot, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Also, Middlesex. Also, I have to say, The Virgin Suicides. And hey, I look forward to reading your next book.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.
You're welcome.